China's story begins not as a vast empire, but as a small, fragile civilization clinging to the fertile banks of the Yellow River. Around 5,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Han Chinese tilled the soil, built walled settlements, and developed traditions that would anchor their identity for millennia. Unlike the wandering horsemen who roamed the northern plains, these people were tied to the rhythm of the land planting, harvesting, and defending what they could not abandon. Their lives were shaped by rivers that flooded with both promise and destruction, and by the constant need for order in a chaotic natural world. From these conditions arose the dynasties that claimed the mandate of heaven, binding the people into a vision of a centralized state. But expansion was never simple. To the east lay the endless ocean. To the south, jungles too thick to clear. To the west and north, however, stretched the true frontier, vast grasslands, deserts, and mountains where no plow could tame the soil. Here lived tribes of mounted nomads, the Xiongnu, the Turks, the Hetans, the Mongols. They were fast, elusive, and ruthless, attacking in lightning raids and vanishing into the horizon before Chinese armies could respond. For centuries, the emperors of China faced a question without a solution: how to defend civilization from barbarians who could not be captured, who had no cities to burn, no walls to besiege. Some emperors tried diplomacy, offering marriage alliances, gifts of silk, and wagon loads of grain to keep the nomads at bay. Others turned to brute force, launching armies across the steppe. But fighting nomads was like trying to catch the wind in your hands. So the Chinese built walls, massive chains of earth and stone that snaked across the northern frontier. The Great Wall became both a shield and a symbol of fear, a reminder that even the mightiest dynasties could not truly conquer the steppe. Yet the irony of history is that the nomads who could never be permanently subdued would sometimes turn the tables and conquer China itself. The Mongols under Genghis Khan and his descendants swept across the empire in the 13th century, toppling the Song dynasty and ruling as the Yuan. They showed how vulnerable China could be when the steppe united under one banner. The Mongol rule did not last long, barely a century, but it scarred Chinese memory. When the Ming rose to power after them, they chose defense over expansion, restoring the Great Wall and retreating into their agrarian heartland. For hundreds of years, this stalemate endured. China was strong, but confined. The nomads were dangerous, but fragmented. Neither side could decisively destroy the other. The borders of China remained stable, hemmed in by geography and fear. But history is never static, and in the 17th century, a new force rose from the forests and plains of the northeast. They were not Chinese, not Mongols, but something in between, a people who would succeed where every dynasty before them had failed. They called themselves the Manchus, and under their rule, China would grow into the colossal empire we recognize today. In the forests and plains beyond the Great Wall, a people once dismissed as peripheral began to forge a destiny that would change the map of Asia forever. They were the Jurchens, later known as the Manchus. Unlike the Mongols of the open steppe, the Jurchens lived in semi-settled societies, practicing both farming and hunting. But their culture, like their neighbors, revolved around the horse and the bow. By the early 1600s, the Ming dynasty was weakening, ravaged by corruption, famine, and a devastating outbreak of plague. This was the moment a charismatic warlord named Narachi seized. Narachi unified the Jurchen tribes, creating a new identity for his people. He reorganized society into the 8 banners, military and social units that transformed clans into a disciplined fighting force. Under his leadership, the Jurchens began their rise, clashing with Ming garrisons and extending their reach across Manchuria. By 1636, Narachi's successor, Hong Taiji, proclaimed a new name for his people, the Manchu. He also declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Qing, laying claim not just to Manchuria, but to all of China. The Ming collapsed soon after. A massive peasant uprising breached Beijing in 1644, and the desperate Ming generals, unable to hold the capital, opened the gates to the Manchus for help. Once inside, the Manchus never left. They established themselves as rulers of China, but they were not content to simply replace the Ming. Unlike previous dynasties, the Manchus recognized that their empire could not survive unless they neutralized the eternal threat of the northern nomads. They knew the Mongols better than the Han ever had, and they understood that walls would never be enough. The Manchu emperors, Kanchi Yongzheng and Qianglong, adopted a new vision: to secure the empire. They would not just defend against the steppe, they would conquer it. For the first time in Chinese history, a dynasty pursued a deliberate policy of expansion into Inner Asia. it was not merely an ambition of glory, it was survival. For 2 millennia, the grasslands had sent wave after wave of horsemen crashing into the Middle Kingdom. The Manchus intended to end that cycle forever. But conquest was not only about army, it was about legitimacy. The Qing emperors claimed multiple identities to appeal to their diverse subjects. To the Han, they portrayed themselves as Confucian, sons of heaven, guardians of tradition. To the Mongols, they emphasized kinship and styled themselves heirs of Genghis Khan. To Tibetans, they appeared as patrons of Buddhism, defenders of the Dalai Lama. This multi-layered identity allowed them to build an empire broader and more enduring than any before. But first, they had to prove themselves on the battlefield, beginning with the most dangerous rivals of all, the Mongols. Even before they fully seized China, the Manchus had already begun to test their strength against the steppe. In the early 1600s, southern Mongolia was dominated by Ligdan Khan, a descendant of Genghis Khan, who dreamed of reviving the Mongol Empire. His ambitions terrified not only his enemies, but even many Mongol tribes themselves, who feared his tyranny and endless wars. When his armies pressed into Manchuria, he collided with the rising Manchu power. For more than a decade, Narachi and later Hong Taiji fought Ligdan in a brutal contest across the grasslands. The Manchus proved more disciplined and cunning. By 1634, they had shattered Ligdan's forces. The Khan fled west, only to die in the deserts of Qinghai. With his death, the dream of a restored Mongol empire collapsed, and southern Mongolia swore allegiance to the Qing. This was a turning point. For the first time, a Chinese dynasty had secured a lasting hold over part of the Mongol homeland. The conquest of Inner Mongolia was not achieved by brute force alone. The Qing skillfully used diplomacy and marriage alliances to bind Mongol aristocrats to their cause. Many southern Mongol princes intermarried with the Manchu imperial family, weaving bonds of loyalty and kinship. The Qing also incorporated Mongol warriors into their 8-banner system, ensuring that Mongols fought not only against the Qing, but also alongside them. This integration was key. By making Mongols stakeholders in the new empire, the Qing reduced the likelihood of unified resistance. Still, the threat was far from gone. To the west, the powerful Oirat Mongols were rising, united under the Dzungar Khanate, led by the dynamic chieftain Galdan. The Dzungars were not only militarily formidable, but also spiritually legitimized by the Dalai Lama of Tibet, who declared Galdan a rightful Khan. This alliance of steppe power and religious authority made the Dzungars a force unlike any China had faced in centuries. For the Qing, the battle for Inner Asia had only just begun. By the late 17th century, the steppe's center of gravity had shifted westward to the Dzungar Khanate in modern-day Xinjiang and Mongolia. Its leader, Galdan Bashuto Khan, was more than just a warlord. He was a strategist who dreamed of uniting the Mongols under his banner. His legitimacy came not only from his military might, but from his endorsement by the Dalai Lama, whose blessing carried immense weight among Buddhist Mongols. Galdan expanded aggressively, sweeping into the Tarim Basin and subduing the oasis cities. In 1686, he turned his gaze east, invading the lands of the Khalkha Mongols, who had already pledged loyalty to the Qing. This was the spark for one of the longest and bloodiest wars of the Qing era. For 10 years, the Dzungars and the Qing clashed across the steppes and mountains in a struggle that drained both sides. The decisive moment came in 1696, when the Kangxi Emperor personally led his armies into the field, a rare act for a Chinese. Emperor Kangxi's forces, bolstered by Khalkha allies, dealt Galdan a crushing defeat. The once mighty Dzungar Khan retreated west, only to die the following year. With his fall, northern Mongolia submitted to Qing authority, bringing both Inner and Outer Mongolia under imperial control. But the Dzungar threat was not extinguished. Successors rebuilt their strength, continuing to challenge Qing dominance for decades. The wars against the Dzungars were not only about territory, but about ideology. Whoever controlled the steppes and claimed the loyalty of the Dalai Lama sway over the Mongols. For the Qing, defeating the Dzungars was not optional, it was existential. These wars would ultimately reshape the entire western frontier, dragging Tibet and Xinjiang into the orbit of the Chinese Empire. Tibet, perched high on the Himalayan plateau, was not a land of soldiers and raiders, but of monasteries and monks. Yet its spiritual authority was immense. Since the 17th century, the Dalai Lama had grown from a religious leader into a king. For the Mongol world, his blessing could elevate a Khan, as it did with Galdan, or delegitimize him. For the Qing emperors, Tibet was both a prize and a problem. At first, Tibet was under the loose control of the Dzungar Khanate, another branch of Oirat Mongols. But in 1717, the Dzungars invaded, overthrowing their rivals and seizing Lhasa. For the Qing, this was intolerable. If the Dalai Lama remained under Dzungar influence, the loyalty of the Mongols within Qing borders would always be suspect. In 1720, Qing armies marched into Tibet, expelling the Dzungars and installing a new Dalai Lama under their watch. From that moment, Tibet was effectively under Qing oversight. The Dalai Lama continued to rule religiously and administratively, but Qing officials, known as ambans, were stationed in Lhasa to ensure imperial interests were protected. This arrangement gave the Qing control over the spiritual heart of Mongol Buddhism, further securing their authority over the steppes. But Tibet was not just about religion. Its geography mattered too. By holding Tibet, the Qing controlled the gateway between China, India, and Central Asia. It gave them a buffer against other empires, from the rising Russians to the British pushing out of India. Tibet's annexation was a crucial piece in the Qing strategy of continental dominance. Yet even with Tibet under their sway, the Dzungar Khanate still loomed in the west, and in the mid-18th century, the Qing would finally decide to eliminate this rival once and for all through conquest. And through one of the bloodiest episodes of genocide in world history. By the mid-18th century, the Qing had subdued Inner and Outer Mongolia, integrated Tibet, and secured their frontiers in the north. But the most dangerous rival still stood the Dzungar Khanate. From their stronghold in the Ili Valley and the deserts of Xinjiang, the Dzungars had built a formidable state, feared from Central Asia to Siberia. They were the last great steppe empire, heirs to the legacy of Genghis Khan, and for the Qing, they were an existential threat. In 1755, the Qianlong Emperor launched his decisive campaign. Qing armies, marching from multiple directions, invaded Dzungar territory with overwhelming force. At first, the conquest seemed swift. The Dzungar ruler Dawachi was captured, and resistance collapsed. But the Qing victory was fragile. Almost immediately, uprisings broke out, led by rival Dzungar chiefs and fueled by resentment against Chinese occupation. The conflict spiraled into a brutal war of annihilation. The Qing response was ruthless. Determined to end the cycle of steppe threats once and for all, Qianlong ordered the systematic extermination of the Dzungars. Contemporary records describe mass killings, famine, and forced deportations. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, entire villages burned, and survivors driven into exile. By the war's end, it is estimated that nearly 80% of the Dzungar population had been wiped out, one of the most devastating genocides in Asian history. But the Qing were not content with destruction alone. Into the emptied lands of Xinjiang, they resettled other peoples: Han Chinese farmers, Manchus, Hui Muslims, and even rival Turkic groups. This deliberate demographic engineering ensured that the Dzungar homeland would never rise again. For the first time, Xinjiang, the new frontier, was incorporated into the Chinese Empire. This victory marked the high tide of Qing expansion. Never before had a dynasty controlled so vast a stretch of Inner Asia. From the forests of Manchuria to the deserts of Kashgar, the Qing frontier now extended thousands of kilometers. But holding such territory required more than armies. It required a new vision of Empire, one that combined force, diplomacy, and administration across a mosaic of peoples and religions. Conquest was only the beginning. By the late 18th century, the Qing ruled not just China proper, but a continental empire of extraordinary diversity. Mongols, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and more. Governing this patchwork required innovation. The Qing could not impose Han Chinese culture on everyone without risking rebellion, nor could they simply allow autonomy. Instead, they developed a system of layered rule, flexible, pragmatic, and often contradictory. In Mongolia, the Qing kept the aristocracy intact, but tied it tightly to Beijing through the banner system and intermarriage. In Tibet, they allowed the Dalai Lama to remain the spiritual head while keeping imperial ambans in Lhasa to monitor politics. In Xinjiang, they created military colonies, resettling loyal populations to dilute local resistance. In all these regions, the Qing carefully balanced force with legitimacy. Religion became a key tool of governance. The emperors styled themselves as patrons of Tibetan Buddhism, commissioning grand monasteries and elaborate rituals to win the loyalty of monks and lay people alike. To the Muslims of Xinjiang, they presented themselves as just rulers who protected Islamic traditions, even as they quietly kept clerics under surveillance. This ability to wear different faces to be Confucian emperors in Beijing, Khans to the Mongols, and Chakravartin Buddhist kings in Tibet was the secret to Qing endurance. But the system was never stable. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. In Xinjiang, Turkic Muslim populations resented Chinese military colonies. In Tibet, the Dalai Lama remained a symbol of resistance. In Mongolia, memories of independence were never forgotten. The empire was vast, but it was also fragile, its unity dependent on the strength of the Qing court. Ironically, it was during this period of glory that cracks began to appear. The Qianlong emperor, who presided over the zenith of Qing expansion, also drained the treasury with endless wars and extravagant projects. Corruption spread, and the bureaucracy grew bloated. While the empire looked invincible on maps, beneath the surface, it was beginning to rot. And beyond its borders, new powers were rising: Russia to the north, Britain to the south, that would soon test the Qing, like no nomads ever had. By the end of the 18th century, the Qing had achieved what no dynasty before them had managed: the unification of China with Inner Asia into a single empire. Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang, all lands once beyond the Great Wall, were firmly under Beijing's control. The dream of neutralizing the nomadic threat had finally been realized. For 2,000 years, Chinese dynasties had feared the horsemen of the steppes. Now, the steppes were part of China. This achievement reshaped not only China, but also Asia as a whole. The fall of the Dzungars destroyed the last great steppe empire, ending a cycle of conquest that had defined Eurasian history since the days of Attila and Genghis Khan. The Qing, by conquering the conquerors, closed a chapter that had lasted for millennia. Yet the legacy was complex. The vast frontiers they created, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, remained culturally distinct, their loyalties often uncertain. Governing them required continuous vigilance, military presence, and political maneuvering. What the Qing saw as triumph, later generations would inherit as challenge. When the Qing began to weaken in the 19th century, these frontier regions became fault lines. Rebellions flared in Xinjiang, uprisings rocked Tibet, and Mongol nationalism simmered. At the same time, European colonial powers and the expanding Russian Empire sought to exploit these weaknesses. What the Qing had forged with blood and strategy now became a burden for modern China. But despite this fragility, the Qing legacy endures. Today, the very borders of the People's Republic of China's claims over Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, a direct inheritance of Qing expansion. Without the Qing conquests, the modern map of China would look entirely different. The story of the Qing Empire is therefore not just history. It is politics, identity, and power that still shape Asia in the 21st century. It is the tale of how a people from beyond the Great Wall built one of the largest empires in history, reshaping the destiny of China and Inner Asia forever.